when I think about media influence or media analysis, I try to think about it from two perspectives. And the first one would be, how does that particular media affect our communication, our interaction, or that specific sphere of influence generally? And by that, I mean all media, when it's when it enters the culture, when it enters our experience, changes us, right? So I would think in general, from that standpoint, whether it was the telegraph or the printing press or the personal computer, they change how we communicate. We're experiencing this differently than we have in the past historically because of that. And we could point to things like embeds with journalists all the way as far back as the Gulf War, and of course all the way up through now, where we have such a high immediacy of information. Well, to me, the things that jump out are the immediacy, right? We have things so much quicker than we did before. And if you look back in history, even something like the Rwandan, genocide, which, a couple million people died, we didn't know a lot about that until months, potentially even years after it occurred. Most people didn't know about it until a movie came out about it, right? So we just didn't have that kind of information available then. But today, both the immediacy, meaning the quickness of how we get things, but also the pipe is now so much huger. There's so much more information coming across that how we are able to experience that is so much faster and so much more available to us. So if we're interested in that, today we can see the results of a bomb dropping 5 minutes after it happens through Instagram, right? These kind of things. So that kind of immediacy happens. But if you kind of drill down a little bit into how the different sides in this conflict have used social, I wouldn't definitely call myself an expert, but I would say what jumps out to me is how they have both sides have used it to try to buoy their own support, right? And of course, Zelensky has used it more on the international side of things, trying to get people, everything from trying to get fighters to come to his country, to get the word out about what's happening, to get valid information, to lobby or pressure countries to help come to their aid, and has done a masterful job as a PR person essentially with that, and had to. He's obviously been put in an incredibly difficult position and is using every tool at his command to try to basically, save their country. I mean, even though, like I talked about, Russia is definitely more closed system and, doing things like trying to, shut down different kinds of communication, they've also used social and digital to communicate to their people the story they want to get out, right? And it brings us to that problem of subjectivity being sometimes a problem when we're trying to get down to this kind of central truth of something. And that can be tough. So, I mean, if you were to look at, I don't know how much we could trust these polls, but most of the polls, even some of the independent polls that come out of Russia, show that there's a high level of support for Putin. And that may be hard for us to understand given these contexts. He's being successful too, is what I guess we should say, in using those media tools to get the message out that he wants to get out to his people. Sometimes when we have so much access to so much information, it can have this desensitizing effect, right? Where it's interesting because it can have both sides depending on which theorist you talk to, either desensitizing effect or this other thing. Gerbner's mean world syndrome is also something that's the opposite. If we watch certain kinds of media all the time, there's an effect that people actually start to think that the world is a much worse place than it actually is statistically. However, if we're watching all of these things all the time, we start to think of them almost as normal, and we have this desensitized effect. We don't realize those are actual human beings under that theater, right? These are if you try to actually relate to what's happening, it's very difficult to do. And when this stuff comes at you, I think there is a problem in our culture sometimes of separating the reality from the entertainment, especially as news has been more packaged as entertainment. And we have so much more in our streaming services that is more informationally based, right? So many more documentaries and so much more true crime. And so there's a line between this is news and reality and this is entertainment has been rather blurred lately. And so I think you're really onto something there when you ask that question, because I think it's something I think we're going to see more of I don't say the word is necessarily a problem, but we're going to see that phenomena where like you're watching the war like you're watching a TV show. And of course, that's not really healthy. These are real human beings. Is the idea of propaganda. And again, to go to the objective, there's propaganda everywhere, right? But that doesn't mean, just because we have propaganda within our own government or our own systems doesn't mean that there aren't, degrees of this, or there aren't abuses that are, much more terrible. And I think we have to look at what Russ is doing and look at it in a totalitarian sense, right? And this is definitely leaning into that lane when you're trying to manipulate information to that degree. As someone who has taught both communication theory and Stratcom, I understand that we are always trying to, put things in the best light, but this is not misinformation and disinformation are not spin. Those are two totally different things. Even with spin, there is some element of truth. You're just putting it in the best light. I think a lot of what's happening in this situation is just false, right? It's meant to engender a certain reaction, and the reality of those facts is secondary completely. And I think that's where when we get into some serious trouble with that kind of thing. And that's why I pointed to the Jacques Ellul, who had done such incredible work on trying to explain to people. Remember that in communication, there was this massive uptick in people trying to understand communication after World War II, because in the retrospect of it, they just couldn't understand what the hell went wrong, that the Holocaust could happen. And they tried to figure how could entire nations end up, buying into this kind of stuff. And they ended up pointing at communication. So yes, we have this kind of knee-jerk reaction to point and say, Hitler at anyone who has anything like that. But there is some legitimacy in worrying about those kind of, totalitarian, reactions or potential outcomes. And those are the things we need to pay very, very close attention to, and history demands that we do so. So, that would be what I would say. In terms of censorship itself, I guess I can only say that, as a calm guy, I'm pretty free speechy, I guess, but what I would say. But I don't go back to that, the strength of a free press is I think, indicative of a healthy culture, quite frankly. And so, though I'm not the journalist side of this, I think that, and I know that our forms of journalism are in transition. I just hope we make sure that we find a way to keep freedom of information and flowing, and that censorship, though necessary to some degree for children and things like that, it's still that we lean toward expression rather than control. I think that I think it's always dangerous when you try to use categories of people to judge morally or ethically, right? I don't care what categories you use, because you are separating moral culpability from agency, right? So people may have done nothing, but because they belong to some category, you're holding them ethically responsible. That's not logical or ethical or moral in any way, right? If we were to zoom back from that, yet it is unfortunately often our human instinct to do that. For whatever horrible reason in us, we seem to do that, even catch ourselves doing that sometimes, right? Oh, all those fill in the blanks, blah, blah, blah. When we get frustrated, we want easy answers. So we look to the category rather than actually trying to say, okay, I need to stop. I need to reflect rather than react, and to understand what's really going on here, who is responsible and make my own judgments rather than join, a tribe or a side in this, to actually use my own reasoning and ideas to figure out what's going on here. And then, if appropriate, can make those, moral kind of calculations. But I just think in general, using broad categories for blame is usually going to get you in trouble. We know that there's a lot of positives that come from social media, the connectedness that it does. We could talk about some of those positives, and I listed some of those. Social media is being used to save people's lives in this thing, to find them, to bring families back together, to get people to the medicine they need. I mean, the things that it offers us are incredible, but it kind of goes back to that objective view. How can we maximize the things that help us when we have a new technology or media that comes into the culture? And how can we minimize those things that become those dangers? I don't think we necessarily have learned yet. We've gamified morality by okay, we're going to turn this whole who's to blame and who we can go after into this game that we play on our social media and on our devices. It's like, I don't remember the name of the book the guy wrote about the woman who was flying to South Africa, who made some comment before she got on the plane that was supposed to be ironic, that she was actually on the side of the people, but they didn't take it as ironic. By the time she landed 11 hours later, she had been completely vilified across social media and had been fired from her job 11 hours. And her whole life has been destroyed because of one comment. And, I'm not making judgment whether she deserved or not to, but boy, I mean, that's when you live in a culture like that, I just start to think, well, I really worry that people are going to start to fear communication, and the outcomes of that are the implications of that are not good. We'll stop talking to each other.